You see, it's strange because at one period when they're asking me, I was saying, no, never. What the hell? Go back. No, not me.
There are children born into ordinary lives who grow up to do extraordinary things. And then there are those born into extraordinary lives who spend their entire existence just trying to feel loved. Julian Lennon belongs to that second group, and his story cuts far deeper than most people realize. His father told the entire world to imagine all the people living life in peace, yet the one person who needed that peace most, his own son, was left searching for it alone for decades. What that does to a child is not something you simply grow out of. When the man singing about love to millions could barely look at you, when you grew up hearing that you were the product of a whiskey bottle rather than love, the damage runs into places that no amount of fame or music or money can easily reach. Julian Lennon's story is not simply about a famous man's son trying to build a career in music. It is about a wound that never fully closed, a father-son relationship that ended before it could be repaired, and a man who had to learn, slowly, painfully, and on his own terms, how to forgive someone who never truly apologized. None of that is simple, and none of it happened quickly, and the full picture is far more heartbreaking than most people ever take the time to understand. To understand Julian, you have to go back to 1957, when John Lennon and Cynthia Powell first crossed paths as students at the Liverpool College of Art. Cynthia was already engaged to someone else at the time, and when she initially turned down John's advances, his response carried the sharp, dismissive edge that would later define so much of his public personality. They began dating anyway, pulled together by a shared world of art and music, and the restless ambition of two young people with nowhere near enough of the world yet. Loving John was never uncomplicated, though. His jealousy flared without warning, his temper was unpredictable, and in the affection he offered could go cold fast. Cynthia stayed regardless, and in 1962, after she became pregnant, the two married, quietly, secretly, because the Beatles' management had decided that a married John Lennon would shatter the fantasy surrounding him. And that's when Cynthia's erasure began in earnest. While John's fame exploded into something entirely unprecedented, she existed in the shadows, hidden from the public like something her husband preferred not to acknowledge. Beatlemania changed everything for John, and essentially nothing for Cynthia, except that it took him further away. The version of her husband who came back from that stratospheric rise was not quite the same man she had married. Around this period, John was introduced to LSD, and Cynthia later described the drug as something that fundamentally altered him, pulling him into experiences she had no way of following. Then in 1966, he walked into a London gallery, and he met a Japanese avant-garde artist named Yoko Ono, and the slow unraveling of his first family began. By 1968, the situation had become impossible to ignore. Yoko was calling the house frequently, stopping by regularly, and when Cynthia confronted John directly, he brushed her off with a claim that Yoko was only trying to raise funding for her art projects. None of that was the truth. While Cynthia was away on holiday in May of that year, John invited Yoko to their home, and the two spent the night recording what became the controversial Two Virgins album. By morning, something between them had shifted permanently, and what it meant for Cynthia became clear the moment she walked back through her own front door. Yoko was sitting in Cynthia's house, wearing Cynthia's bathrobe, drinking tea beside John as if the whole arrangement were perfectly ordinary. John looked up and offered two words, "Oh, hi," and that was essentially the end. And Cynthia left the house that day and never really came back to the marriage. What followed was messy and humiliating in ways that went beyond ordinary heartbreak. A man named Alexis Mardas, a friend of the Beatles, claimed to have been with Cynthia after she walked out that evening, and John initially used that claim to pursue a divorce on grounds of infidelity. He eventually abandoned that position and allowed Cynthia to file on her own terms, but the settlement she received told its own story. £100,000, a modest annual payment, and custody of their son Julian. For a woman who had given years of her life to a man who preached love as a philosophy while practicing something very different at home, it was a bitter kind of ending. John and Yoko married in 1969, quickly becoming one of the most discussed couples in all of popular culture, and together they had a son named Sean, who came to represent the new life John had chosen, the life built after Julian and Cynthia had been left behind. That life with Yoko lasted until December 8th, 1980, when a man named Mark David Chapman waited outside John and Yoko's New York City apartment building and shot John 4 times as he returned home. Rushed to the hospital, John was pronounced dead on arrival. Chapman did not run. He sat down on the pavement with a novel and waited calmly until the police arrived and took him away. And he has remained behind bars ever since, denied parole on multiple occasions. The world grieved in a way that rarely happens for any single person. But for Julian Lennon, the grief arrived already tangled up with anger, resentment, and the unbearable weight of everything that would now never be resolved. Julian Charles John Lennon came into the world on April 8, 1963, at Sefton General Hospital in Liverpool. John named him after his own mother, Julia Lennon, who had died years before Julian was born. A tribute that carried genuine tenderness, which makes the emotional distance that followed all the more difficult to reconcile. Growing up, Julian was surrounded by legendary figures. Brian Epstein, the man who managed the Beatles, served as his godfather. None of that proximity to greatness translated into having a present father, though, and after the divorce when Julian was 5 years old, and his contact with John became sporadic and emotionally fraught. The version of John Lennon that the world celebrated, the visionary, the peace advocate, the man who wrote some of the most beloved songs in the history of recorded music, was not the version Julian knew. What Julian knew was a father who could be cruel and dismissive and absent in ways that left lasting damage on how he understood his own worth. Paul McCartney watched it all unfold and felt genuine sympathy for the child caught in the center of it. His response was to write what became one of the most famous songs ever recorded, originally titled Hey Jules, before he changed the name to Hey Jude, thinking it easier to sing. McCartney wrote it specifically to comfort Julian during his parents' divorce, a small act of care from a man who was not Julian's father, but behaved more like one than John often did. The song became enormous. And for Julian, it would carry complicated feelings for most of his life. Cynthia raised Julian largely on her own after the split, working to create stability in a situation that had very little natural stability to offer. Julian attended King's School in Hoylake before the family moved to Wales following his mother's remarriage, and he went on to Ruthin School, a private boarding school in Denbighshire in North Wales. Away from the noise and weight of his father's fame, Julian started discovering who he actually was. A love for art developed, a love for music, a creative instinct that was entirely his own, even if the world would always try to trace it back to John. And there was a brief window in the mid-1970s when father and son actually connected in a way that felt real. John's then-girlfriend, May Pang, encouraged him to spend more time with Julian, and for a short period, those efforts produced something genuinely warm between them. One Christmas, John bought Julian a Gibson Les Paul guitar and a drum machine, sat with him and taught him chord shapes, and gave him the kind of unhurried attention that Julian had rarely experienced. That period stayed with Julian as some of the happiest memories of his childhood, full of laughter, ease, and the rare feeling that his father was actually there with him. But it didn't last, because John returned to Yoko, and the warmth disappeared again, leaving Julian holding memories of what that connection had briefly felt like. Music pulled at Julian from early on, and at just 11 years old he appeared on his father's Walls and Bridges album, playing drums on the track Ya Ya. He would joke later that if he had known the recording was going to end up on the album, he would have played considerably better. The credit planted something in him regardless, and through his teenage years, he absorbed influences well beyond his father's catalog. David Bowie, Steely Dan, AC/DC, all fed into the musical sensibility he was building quietly inside himself. Then in 1984, at 21 years old, Julian released his debut album, Valotte, and the reception was immediate. Producer Phil Ramone shaped the record into something polished and emotionally direct. The single Too Late for Goodbyes became a genuine hit. And Julian received a Grammy nomination for Best New Artist, an achievement that belonged entirely to him, even if every review and every interview found a way to measure it against his father's shadow. Paul McCartney sent a congratulatory telegram which meant a great deal, but Julian understood clearly that carving his own identity in music meant fighting comparisons he hadn't asked for and couldn't escape simply by being good. His second album, The Secret Value of Daydreaming, and landed in 1986 to a cooler critical reception, though the single Stick Around climbed to number 1 on the US Album Rock Tracks chart. Julian kept pushing himself into new territory, performing at the Royal Albert Hall in London in a production of The Hunting of the Snark, collaborating with George Harrison on the 1991 album Help Yourself, releasing the environmentally charged Saltwater, which became one of his most personally meaningful songs. A cover of Ruby Tuesday for the Wonder Years soundtrack demonstrated a range that had nothing to do with Beatle nostalgia. In 1998, he released Photograph Smile on his own independent label, a mature and carefully constructed record that critics received warmly, with some noting that it would have been praised even more highly if listeners could separate it from the legacy it inevitably carried. The compliment had a sting in it, but it was honest. In 2009, Julian turned back toward one of the most personal corners of his own history. His childhood drawing, a watercolor of his friend Lucy O'Donnell surrounded by stars, had inspired John to write Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, one of the most recognizable songs in the Beatles' catalog. But Lucy herself had gone on to develop lupus, a serious autoimmune disease, and Julian responded by writing and releasing a tribute song called Lucy in Her Honor, and donating half the proceeds to lupus research. That gesture revealed something about who Julian had become. A man who had spent so much of his life processing his own pain and still found the capacity to show up meaningfully for someone else's. In 2011 came Everything Changes, later documented in the film Through the Picture Window, which followed Julian's creative process and included reflections from artists, including Steven Tyler and Bono. Then in 2022, he released Jude, an album whose title carried enormous personal weight. Named for the McCartney song written to comfort him as a child, Julian described calling the album Jude as a coming-of-age moment, a way of finally facing himself directly, accepting where he came from and what he had survived. In 2024, he returned with a freshly remixed version of I Should Have Known, working with producer Spike Stent, describing the song as a favorite he had always wanted to breathe new life into. The release served as another reminder that Julian Lennon's artistry never stopped moving forward, even as the world never stopped trying to reduce him to a footnote in his father's story. Music and art have always been survival tools for Julian rather than simply career choices, because the emotional injuries left by John Lennon were real and deep and did not dissolve with time. John reportedly told Julian at some point that Sean had been conceived in love while Julian had come out of a whiskey bottle on a Saturday night. That comment became one of the defining scars of Julian's life, a thing said by a father to a son that no child should ever hear. Julian admitted in interviews that he had never truly wanted to know everything his father had said about him, because what he had already heard was painful enough. He spoke about John's public image as a champion of peace and love with something close to bitterness, saying that John could offer that message to the entire world, but never managed to deliver it to the people closest to him, his wife and his son. Julian also recognized his father's darker emotional patterns inside himself, the aggression and the edge, and described actively working against those tendencies, choosing a different path than the one he had inherited. His relationship with Paul McCartney offered a kind of counterweight to all of that. The two spent real time together during Julian's childhood. More time, Julian has said, than he spent with his own father. Pictures of the two of them playing together far outnumber pictures of Julian with John from those years. McCartney's consistent presence and genuine affection gave Julian a version of what a caring adult figure could actually look like, and that contrast made John's distance feel all the sharper by comparison. The relationship between Julian and Yoko Ono carried its own separate complications. Yoko had not caused John's emotional failures as a father, but she represented the rupture. She was the woman John had chosen over Cynthia, and later the person who controlled everything John left behind. When John died in 1980, his will directed an estate valued at approximately $220 million entirely to Yoko. Julian received nothing. Over the years that followed, the estate generated enormous royalty income, all of it flowing through Yoko's control, and Julian eventually pursued legal action. After 16 years of litigation, he reached a settlement believed to be in the region of $20 million. The money mattered, but the legal battle was never really only about money. What Julian was seeking was acknowledgement, recognition that he had been wronged, that his existence deserved more than it had received, that his father's choices had consequences that deserved to be addressed. Yoko, for her part, acknowledged the divide with a kind of pragmatic honesty, noting that warmth between herself and Julian would inevitably cause pain to others connected to him. The relationship between them never became easy or close, but it found a functional kind of peace, and the person most responsible for that was Sean. Julian's love for his half-brother Sean became the bridge he crossed towards something resembling peace with Yoko. He has spoken about this directly and with real clarity, explaining that hurting Sean's mother meant hurting Sean, and because his love for Sean was genuine, he chose to let go of the resentment he had carried for so long. Not because the wounds had healed entirely, not because everything had been made right, but because love for a brother pulled harder than the pull of old pain. And in September 2010, something quietly extraordinary happened at the opening of Julian's photography exhibition, Timeless in New York. Standing in that room, for what was believed to be the first time, were Cynthia Lennon, Sean Lennon, Yoko Ono, May Pang, and Julian himself. 5 people each shaped profoundly and differently by their connection to John Lennon. And rather than tension filling that room, there was laughter, there were embraces, there was something that looked, at least for an evening, like genuine peace. Forgiveness has been a process for Julian rather than a destination, something returned to repeatedly rather than achieved once and filed away. Recording Lucy helped move him forward. Watching the Beatles' Get Back documentary helped in a different way, letting him see his father young and funny and loose on screen and feel the connection to the man he remembered from childhood before everything fell apart. Julian described falling in love with his father again, watching that footage, recognizing the goofy and charming person he had known briefly before the distance set in permanently. In 2020, he told an interviewer that he still actively strives for forgiveness and understanding, that his father had been moving toward genuine reconciliation in the final period of his life, that John had expressed a real desire to reconnect with Julian and with his broader family, and that his death on that December night in 1980 stole any chance of that ever happening. Julian carries the unlived future with him, the conversations that never came, the relationship that might have become something better given time. And yet he keeps moving, making music, making art, making photographs, making meaning out of a life that started in the shadow of one of the greatest artists the world has ever produced, and has become, slowly and stubbornly and entirely on its own terms, something that belongs only to him.